In a land where loyalty was once the heartbeat of the people, a dark betrayal threatened to tear everything apart. A king, blinded by ambition, made a pact that would cost him more than he bargained for. His people, strong, proud, and unyielding, began to whisper of rebellion. But how far can a leader go before his throne crumbles beneath him? And what happens when the very souls you trade away return to haunt you? Stay tuned to Savannah Storytime for a tale of power, greed, and the unbreakable spirit of a united people. Hit that subscribe button and prepare to uncover the shocking truth behind the fall of a kingdom. The palace of Ojimma stood tall against the moonlit sky, its bronze gates gleaming like a silent sentinel. Inside, the air was thick with unease, and the once majestic throne room now bore the weight of its king's troubled mind. King Ezenwaka, known far and wide as the roaring lion, sat on his carved ebony throne, but tonight, his roar was muted. The whispers had reached him, rumors of neighboring kingdoms forging pacts with pale-skinned traders, arming themselves with weapons that spat fire and smoke. Muskets. Cannons. Instruments of power that could crush Ojimma's spears like dry leaves. Ezenwaka's mind buzzed with these thoughts as he paced the room, his royal robes dragging against the polished floor. How does a king protect his people from shadows he cannot see? He muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. Then came the sound, a deliberate knock on the heavy palace doors. Slow. Purposeful. It echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. The guards hesitated, but Ezenwaka raised his hand. Let him in. The foreigner entered, his boots tapping against the floor in a rhythm that felt almost mocking. Captain Wilhelm was a man of sharp features and sharper intentions. His pale skin gleamed under the flickering torchlight, and his calculating eyes scanned the room as though he already owned it. He bowed low, but the curve of his lips betrayed the arrogance hidden behind the gesture. Your Majesty, Wilhelm began, his accent thick yet deliberate, a king as wise as yourself must see the winds of change sweeping through these lands. It is better to ride the storm than to be swept away by it. Ezenwaka's jaw tightened, his pride prickling at the veiled warning. Speak plainly, trader. I have no patience for riddles tonight. Wilhelm smiled, a snake smile, slow and deliberate. I bring an offer, one that will ensure Ojimma stands strong against any threat. Muskets. Cannons. Enough to make your enemies tremble at the mention of your name. Ezenwaka's eyes narrowed, suspicion wrestling with curiosity. And what would you ask in return for such generosity? Wilhelm's smile widened, his teeth flashing like a predator closing in on its prey. Your kingdom has what we need. Strong backs. Strong hands. Workers for our plantations. Surely, Your Majesty, Ojimma can spare a few for its future. The room fell silent, the weight of the proposal pressing against the walls like a suffocating fog. Ezenwaka sat back on his throne, his fingers drumming against the armrest. The words gnawed at him. Workers. No, not workers. Slaves. But the promise of power, of ensuring Ojimma's dominance, dangled before him like a ripe fruit just out of reach. These workers, Ezenwaka said slowly, his voice measured, will not be from my villages. Only criminals. Prisoners of war. The undesirables. Wilhelm shrugged, his indifference as cold as his words. The specifics matter not to me, Your Majesty. As long as the numbers are met. The king stared at the foreigner, the flickering flames casting shadows on his face. In that moment, Ezenwaka convinced himself this was the right choice, the only choice. A king must make sacrifices for his people, even if those sacrifices were his own. It will be done, Ezenwaka said finally, the words tumbling from his lips like stones in a river. Wilhelm bowed again, his eyes gleaming with triumph. A wise decision, Your Majesty. One that will secure Ojimma's future. As the foreigner left, Ezenwaka sank deeper into his throne. He told himself he was protecting his kingdom. The sun hovered lazily over the village square in Zugura, painting the red clay huts with a golden glow. The air smelled of freshly harvested yams, mingling with the laughter of children playing in the open. Women pounded fufu in large wooden mortars, their rhythmic movements a symphony of peace. It was just another day in Ojimma, or so the villagers thought. A low rumble disrupted the harmony, the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. Soldiers clad in Ojimma's royal colors descended into the square, their faces stern and unyielding. Their leader, a stout man with a thick scar running down his cheek, raised his spear, signaling the villagers to stop what they were doing. By order of His Majesty King Ezenwaka, all men and women of strength are to report here immediately, the scar-faced soldier barked. His voice carried authority. "What is this about?" one elder asked, stepping forward with his walking stick. The soldier ignored him, instead motioning for his men to spread out. Amara, the village's weaver, stood by her loom, her sharp eyes darting across the scene. "Chibondo," a woman screamed, clutching her young son. They grabbed him by the arms, dragging him toward the square's center. "What crime has he committed?" Amara shouted, her voice cutting through the growing murmurs of the crowd. Scarface turned to her, his grip tightening on his spear. "This is not your concern, woman." "Not my concern." Amara scoffed, her voice laced with biting sarcasm. "When you drag away our strongest men, leaving us to fend for ourselves. Tell me, good soldier, how will you answer when the women must fight your wars?" But the soldiers didn't flinch. Instead, they moved quickly, rounding up not just Chibondo but others, farmers, young women, even a boy barely old enough to hold a hoe. "This isn't war," the elder said again, his voice firmer this time. "This is something else." Amora's heart sank as she noticed the way the soldiers avoided meeting their eyes. They weren't here to explain. They were here to obey. And the orders came from the palace. As Chibondo was chained alongside the others, he looked back at Amara, his face a mixture of fear and regret. "Take care of my mother," he mouthed before being shoved into the group. The soldiers mounted their horses, their captives trailing behind them like a funeral procession. The village watched in silence, the weight of the moment sinking into their bones. Ezenwaka sat on the edge of his throne, fingers drumming against the armrest, his once commanding posture now bent with unease. The reports from his spies were clear: the neighboring kingdoms were gathering strength, their foreign muskets already claiming smaller territories. Ojimma, proud and resilient, was losing its edge. This was the thought that kept him awake at night, the possibility of his kingdom bowing to outsiders. But the weapons he had were not enough. Wilhelm had delivered on his promise: muskets, cannons, and swords, but they required more. The trader had been unrelenting during their last meeting, demanding more slaves than Ezenwaka could gather from prisoners and war captives. "This kingdom is not made of criminals," Ezenwaka muttered under his breath, pacing the throne room. Yet, in his heart, he had already made the decision. He had justified it to himself in every way possible. The kingdom's survival was paramount. What were a few sacrifices if it meant securing Ojimma's future? The council chamber buzzed with murmurs as his advisors debated solutions for their depleting resources. A timid voice rose above the din. It was Namdi, the eldest advisor, gray-haired and hunched with age. "Your Majesty, the people grow restless. Disappearances from the villages are being noticed. The young and able are vanishing like morning mist, leaving the elders to tend the farms. This cannot continue." Ezenwaka stopped pacing and turned, his eyes dark and heavy. "And what do you propose, Namdi?" "That I let Ojimma be swallowed whole. That I surrender our lands to the muskets of Akaribo. There is only victory or ruin. If a few must fall to protect the many, then so be it." The room fell silent. No one dared to challenge him. His words carried the weight of finality, but even the youngest advisor could feel the undercurrent of unease growing. The moon hung low over the forest, casting silvery streaks of light through the thick canopy. In a clearing near the river, a group of villagers gathered, their faces tense but determined. Obialo stood in the center, his calm demeanor commanding attention. He was flanked by Amara, her sharp gaze scanning the group, and Ojimma, the elder whose presence lent weight to their cause. "It starts with whispers," Obialo began, his voice steady. Whispers turn to action, and action becomes the storm that topples even the tallest Iroko tree. The villagers nodded, some gripping crude farming tools while others clenched their fists. They had all seen the signs: neighbors disappearing, children snatched in the night, and the growing fear in every corner of Ojimma. Amara stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The king wants us to believe this is for the good of Ojimma. He says the weapons will protect us. But tell me, who will those weapons protect when there's no one left to hold them?" The group murmured in agreement. A blacksmith raised his hand. "But how do we fight a king with an army? We're farmers, weavers, hunters, not soldiers." Amara smirked. "And yet it was farmers who taught warriors how to survive on the land. We are not weak, we've just forgotten our strength." Ojimma, who had been silent until now, raised her hand. The group fell quiet. "This is no ordinary battle," she said, her voice rasping with age. "The king has sold not just our people, but his soul. If we fail to act, the spirit of Ojimma will fade, and with it, our future." Obialo stepped forward again, his tone firm. "We formed the Okike Society tonight. Our first mission: disrupt the trade routes. Captain Wilhelm's ships are nothing without the bodies we provide. If we can cut off his supply, we weaken his hold over the king." A hunter, tall and wiry, stepped forward. "I can lead a group to the eastern routes. We know the forest better than the soldiers ever will." Amara grinned, her fiery spirit infectious. "And I keep the people's hearts alive. A few songs in the market, a tale here and there, let the king's own people start to question his actions." The villagers nodded, their spirits lifting. One by one, they disappeared into the shadows, their footsteps silent against the forest floor. The Okike Society had been born, and with it, the first spark of hope in a kingdom on the brink of collapse. The sun rose reluctantly that morning, as if it had grown tired of illuminating King Ezenwaka's kingdom. In the palace courtyard, the king stood tall, his arms folded, his gaze cold and unyielding. Around him, his advisors shuffled nervously, glancing at each other for the courage to speak. None dared to challenge the growing madness of their ruler, a man once celebrated for his wisdom and compassion. "What news do you bring?" Ezenwaka's voice broke the silence like a whip. His eyes, sharp and piercing, scanned the faces of his court. "Your Majesty," began one advisor, "the people are restless. The whispers of rebellion grow louder. Villages are refusing to send their tributes. Even Zugura." "Zugura," Ezenwaka interrupted, his tone icy. "The village that harbors traitors." The advisor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Your Majesty," they claim innocence. "Burning a village may escalate the unrest." Ezenwaka's expression darkened. He turned his back to the court, pacing slowly. His steps were deliberate, the sound of his sandals echoing ominously. "Escalate. Escalate." He spun around, his face a storm of anger. "Do you think I fear escalation? Let them see what happens to those who defy their king. Let Zugura burn." A collective gasp escaped the court, but no one dared to speak. No one, except Akabondo. "My king," Akabondo stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension. "Zugura is your people. They have given you their loyalty for generations. To destroy them now." "To destroy them now," Ezenwaka cut in, his voice rising, is to remind every village what loyalty cost. Do not mistake my mercy for weakness, Akabondo. You will obey, Ezenwaka declared. Zugura burns tonight. If you cannot lead the charge, I will find someone who can. With that, the king stormed out of the courtyard, his royal robes billowing behind him, and the court dispersed in uneasy murmurs. The village of Zugura hummed with the quiet rhythm of a late evening. A faint glow from scattered lanterns danced against the darkness, while the murmur of voices carried on the breeze. Beneath the cover of tall baobab trees, the Okike Society meeting was about to start, and tonight's agenda was critical. They had to finalize the plans for disrupting the next slave shipment. As the small group slipped through the shadows, they didn't notice the faint rustling of leaves above them. Soldiers, alert and waiting, gripped their spears tightly. Ezenwaka had set a trap, and Amara, bold and defiant, had walked right into it. Move! Surround them, a guttural command shattered the stillness. The forest erupted with noise as the king's guards descended from their hiding spots. Amara's companions scattered, but she was captured and dragged away, her feet digging into the ground as she resisted every step. The other villagers watched from a distance, their hearts heavy with fear and helplessness. The night was alive with music, laughter, and the rustling of colorful costumes. The Festival of Masks had always been Ojimma's most joyous celebration, a time for the people to lose themselves in dance and disguise. But tonight, behind every cheerful mask, there were eyes burning with resolve. This wasn't just a festival, it was a battlefield cloaked in song. Obialo adjusted his mask, a striking creation of red and black with jagged patterns that mimicked the flames he intended to unleash. Beside him, other members of the Okike Society blended seamlessly into the crowd, their hidden weapons strapped beneath flowing robes. They weren't performers, they were rebels. The palace loomed in the distance, its grand silhouette lit by rows of torches. Guards patrolled lazily, distracted by the festivities. It was the perfect cover. Amara's absence weighed heavily on Obialo. She should have been here, her laughter weaving through the air like a melody. Instead, she was in chains, a pawn in the king's twisted game. Obialo clenched his fist. Tonight, they would set her free, or die trying. The festival dancers began their routine, a hypnotic swirl of color and rhythm that drew everyone's attention. Among them was Nkem, a young Okike Society recruit who had volunteered to distract the guards. His clumsy yet enthusiastic dance steps earned laughter from the crowd, and crucially, from the soldiers. They didn't notice as Obialo and a small group slipped into the palace grounds. Inside, the palace was quieter than expected, though the faint sound of drums still carried from outside. Obialo signaled to his team, and they moved swiftly down the dimly lit corridors. But then, as they turned a corner, they came face to face with a soldier. His eyes darted to Obialo's face, and for a moment, recognition flared. "You," the soldier began, his hand moving toward his weapon. Before he could finish, one of the rebels stepped forward, dropping a basket of festival props. With quick thinking, the rebel grabbed a mask and pressed it into the soldier's hands. "Can you believe this? I told him this mask would suit him better," the rebel said with exaggerated cheerfulness. The soldier blinked, caught off guard by the sudden humor. Another rebel joined in. "We thought you were part of the show. With that face, you'd fit right in." The soldier frowned, then chuckled, his suspicion disarmed. "Get out of here, fools. This isn't your place." They hurried past him, hearts pounding. Obialo cast a glance at the rebel who had spoken, a blissful nod. The air in the palace courtyard was thick with tension, as though even the walls knew treachery was afoot. The captives, bound and weary, sat in a defeated line near the palace gates. Among them was Amara, her chin lifted defiantly despite the shackles on her wrists. Her spirit had yet to bow, though her body bore the bruises of her capture. Captain Wilhelm arrived with his usual flair. King Ezenwaka emerged from the palace, his robes trailing behind him like the remnants of his dignity. He carried himself with an air of authority, but his eyes darted nervously. He knew his actions had stirred unrest, but the allure of power drowned his caution. "Your Majesty," Wilhelm began with exaggerated respect, bowing slightly. "Your goods, as promised. Enough firepower to make Ojimma the envy of all neighboring kingdoms." "And the payment?" Ezenwaka asked, his voice tight. His gaze shifted to the captives. Wilhelm gestured toward the line of prisoners with a flick of his gloved hand. "These fine specimens will suffice. Strong backs, skilled hands, a fair exchange, wouldn't you agree?" The king hesitated for a moment, but his resolve hardened. He nodded toward his guards. "Prepare them for transport." Amara chose this moment to speak, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Tell me, Your Majesty, what's your plan after there's no one left to rule? Will you sell the throne next?" The crowd of onlookers, mostly palace workers and a few gathered villagers, gasped. Ezenwaka turned sharply to Amara, his face a mix of fury and embarrassment. "Silence her," he barked. Amara seized the moment, raising her voice. "You hear that? Our king sells his people for weapons. And for what? So he can rule over the ashes of Ojimma." The guards hesitated, their loyalty shaken. A few began whispering among themselves. Wilhelm, sensing the change in the air, turned to Ezenwaka. "Get this under control, now." But it was too late. The spark had been lit. From the shadows of the courtyard, Obialo and his group of rebels emerged, their presence signaling the start of what would soon become an unstoppable uprising. The palace was no longer a place of silence and control. Chaos erupted like a wild storm, as villagers armed with courage and makeshift weapons stormed the gates. King Ezenwaka ran inside and sat on his grand throne room, gripping his spear tightly. His guards stood nervously around him, their confidence wavering with every cheer from the crowd outside. In the courtyard, the rebellion unfolded like a carefully orchestrated play. Fires crackled as the armory was set ablaze. The smell of burning wood and gunpowder mixed with the shouts of freedom. Ezenwaka's fury boiled over as the doors to his throne room trembled under the weight of pounding fists and kicks. "They dare challenge me," he spat, his voice trembling with both anger and fear. "I am their king." But his words held no power now. Surprisingly, his loyal guards tuned against him as the door burst open, and there stood Obialo, flanked by Akabondu and a wave of villagers. "You are no king, Ezenwaka," Obialo said, his voice steady. "A king protects his people. You sold yours for greed." Ezenwaka rose from his throne, his spear shaking in his hands. "You think you can judge me? Do you know the weight of this throne? I did what was necessary to save Ojimma." "Save it for whom?" Obialo countered, stepping closer. "The foreigners. Your weapons. You've left Ojimma with no one to save." Ezenwaka looked at the faces before him, faces of people he had betrayed, people he had once vowed to protect. The weight of his actions seemed to crash down all at once. "You think you've won," he muttered, dropping his spear. "You'll see. Without me, Ojimma will fall." "No," Obialo said, his voice calm but firm. "Without you, Ojimma will rise." With that, Ezenwaka was dragged from his throne. The villagers' chants grew louder, echoing through the palace as they marched their former king to his judgment. The rebellion was no longer just a fight, it was the dawn of a new Ojimma. At mid-morning, the riverbank was unusually quiet, save for the occasional croak of a distant frog and the soft rustle of reeds swaying in the wind. The villagers gathered in silence, their faces a tapestry of grim determination. Captain Wilhelm, now stripped of his swagger, sat tied to the splintered remains of an old canoe. His once pristine coat was smeared with dirt, his pale face drawn and shadowed by fear. The canoe creaked under his weight as they hauled it to the edge of the water. He squirmed and shouted, desperation thick in his voice. "You fools! You need me. You think this will stop others from coming?" His threats dissolved into incoherent rumblings as the villagers walked without a word. Amara stepped forward, her gaze steady and unyielding. "This river has always carried life and hope. Today, it carries away betrayal." Her voice, calm and firm, cut through the night like the blade of a hunter. With one final push, the canoe slid into the water, bobbing precariously before catching the current. Wilhelm's protests turned into panicked screams as the river embraced its new burden. The villagers stood at the water's edge, watching until the canoe disappeared into the mist. His voice faded, swallowed by the endless flow of the river. The village square buzzed with new life. At the center of the square, Obialo stood on a wooden platform, his steady voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. His hands were calloused, his face streaked with sweat and dust, a leader who had labored alongside his people. "Today, Ojimma begins anew," he declared, his voice firm yet humble. "We will rebuild, not just with wood and stone, but with trust, unity, and the strength that lives in each of us." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Obialo raised a hand for silence. "I am not your king, nor do I wish to be. A throne belongs to one, but Ojimma belongs to all. The strength of this land lies not in its throne, but in its people. Never forget that." In the dungeon, far from the laughter and music of Ojimma, King Ezenwaka, or what was left of him, were the tattered remains of his royal robes. His crown was gone, his hands trembling as they clawed at the thorny vines that snagged his path. He muttered to himself, a broken melody of pride and despair. "I was their king. I protected them. They turned on me." His words faded into hoarse whispers as he sank to his knees by a stream, its clear waters reflecting a face he barely recognized. For a moment, he looked around hoping he might escape. But there was nothing ahead, only the tall walls. And so, the echoes of choices made and lives forever changed linger in the winds of Ojimma. The story doesn't end here, it never does. A kingdom rebuilt, a throne abandoned, and a legacy rewritten, but what becomes of a man haunted by his own greed? To uncover more tales of love, betrayal, and redemption from the heart of Africa, make sure you subscribe to Savannah Storytime. Every story has a lesson, every lesson has a twist. Don't miss the next chapter. Your journey begins here.